Tonight is the second lecture in our series for the year, Local History. We're focusing on the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. And what our lectures are doing are they're telling the story of the quest for freedom from 1776 to 2026. So at the last lecture, we looked at the history of colonial churches in Virginia. And today we're going to be talking about John Brown and the Harpers Ferry Raid. Some of you may know that we have a nonfiction book group, and that book group meets over at Westminster Canterbury. We meet 5 times a year. And this year that group is also reading forward in history. And we will be meeting on October 22nd at 10:30 in the morning at the Hume Room at Westminster Canterbury, and we will be reading a biography of John Brown called Midnight Rising by Tony Horwitz. So I would invite you, if you're interested in learning more after tonight's lecture, to check out that book and maybe join us for that discussion. It's free and open to everyone. So welcome. If you haven't been with us before, just a reminder, there are refreshments at the back. Please help yourselves. And you're also here during what is called Banned Books Week. Every week there is every year there is a week called Banned Books Week, and it's run by the American Library Association. Jones Memorial Library is honored to have been one of 5 libraries across the country chosen for a Freedom to Read Judith Krug programming grant to raise awareness about the freedom to read. And what we did was we actually focused on examples from the library's own history. So we're telling that story about the freedom to read in Central Virginia from 1660 to about the 1960s. So I would welcome you to take a look here at the panels at the back and also the items in the cases, which illustrate the stories and the topics that have been sort of hot button topics in Central Virginia over that time period. A reminder that our lectures are recorded and they are placed on our YouTube channel. So if you missed the September lecture, just go to our YouTube channel and you can see Marge and Joe Freeman speaking about colonial churches in Virginia. And so tonight's lecture will be recorded and it's available roughly 3 to 4 weeks after the lecture. I would also invite you, we have a little bit of sort of show and tell for tonight's lecture. We have items which are brought by our lecturer here on the table in front, and then you'll notice on the wall behind in the display case is Jones Memorial Library's Harpers Ferry John Brown Pike. And so I would welcome you to come take a look after the lecture to look at this artifact, which was authenticated by Ben Greenbaum in Richmond about a year and a half ago. And so it is the blade, the pike part, and Steve will probably speak a little bit more about this in his remarks, is authenticated as being one of the first batch of weapons that was manufactured for John Brown, made in Connecticut. We know that the shaft of that weapon is more local because it's made of yellow pine and not of ash, as you would find in Connecticut. So it's an interesting composite, and I encourage you to take a look. But it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. And we are very fortunate to have him stepping in for Ben Greenbaum, who unfortunately had an unforeseeable conflict and can't be with us tonight. Dr. Steven J. Schmit is a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel with the 6th Armored Cavalry. He has a 21-year career as a military police officer and was an assistant professor of military history at the University of Richmond. A graduate of Fishburne Military School, West Virginia University, the University of Tennessee, and Tennessee State University, Steve holds a PhD from Virginia Commonwealth University, and he came to us tonight from Richmond, so he has traveled quite a number of miles to be with us, and we appreciate that. He is the author of Swords and Sabers of the Union Army and Other Works, and he has held positions with the Museum of the Confederacy and the Marine Raider Museum, among other things. In his spare time, he restores artifacts for clients around the world and curates exhibitions for historical groups. He's a very accomplished man, and just reading his CV was really impressive. So I have not done him justice, but you will see tonight. And so please join me in welcoming Steve Schmit.
Well, thank you, Deb, for the introduction. Indeed, I am Steve Schmit, and I am not Ben Greenbaum. I hope that will be a treat for you, because I've known Ben Greenbaum for 3 decades, and he's not me, thank goodness. I must admit, the story of John Brown is somewhat personal to me. I grew up all over the country. My father was a mining engineer, so we moved all over, and the home office was in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota mining manufacturing. But we were transferred back and forth all over the country. In his last assignment, he was offered a choice. And this was in 1959 or 1960, he said. And the company said, well, thank you. The company said, well, you got 2 alternatives or retirement. One alternative is to go to Colombia and take over operation of an emerald mine. That sounds pretty fascinating. If he had taken that, I could speak Spanish fluently. But he turned that one down. Thinking about Colombia in 1960, probably pretty primitive. It's rough there now, even now with drug cartels and such. But the other alternative was, well, you can go to West Virginia. I don't know which was worse. But he chose the West Virginia. And as it turned out, it was a great assignment for me as a youngster, because I was always interested in history. And as it turned out, we were 9 miles from Charlestown, and you'll see how important Charlestown is to this story. We were 17 miles from Harpers Ferry, and you'll see how important that is to the conclusion of the story as well. But I want to spend a lot of time, almost everybody knows the ending of the story, but not a whole lot of folks really appreciate the beginning of the story. So let's start with like page 1. John Brown was actually born in Torrington, Connecticut. Now, we always associate him with Harpers Ferry or Bleeding, Kansas, but he actually comes from the East. And it's kind of interesting as well that while I may not believe in fate and overall coincidences and stuff, but my military career kind of followed John Brown's locales. For example, not only Harpers Ferry and Charlestown when I was a teenager, but in the military I had an assignment up in Connecticut. And where was John Brown born? In Torrington, Connecticut, just northwest of Hartford. And indeed, while I was in Connecticut, I was the operations officer for an Army recruiting battalion, had 36 recruiting stations throughout all of Connecticut and western 4 counties of Massachusetts. So I had a recruiting station in Torrington, of all places. And I also had a recruiting station in Springfield, Massachusetts. And you'll see how that comes into play because Brown spends a lot of time there as well. Lo and behold, later in my career, I found myself as a student at the Army Command General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas for a year. And we're going to talk a lot about Kansas and John Brown and why he ends up there. And that's a major part of the story. So it is kind of intriguing that I've kind of made full circle with John Brown's legacy. But that's not the end of that story either. My late wife was a direct descendant of the Brown family. In fact, her grandfather, Lawrence Brown, was the grandson of Frederick Brown, which was one of the younger brothers of John Brown. So when her parents became aged, and it was time to start disseminating the family lore, and her grandfather, Lawrence, had collected a lot of stuff on Brown and the family. So lo and behold, my wife's older brother had no interest in the Brown legacy. My wife had no interest in the Brown legacy. Hey, there's only one historian left. It was me. So I actually inherited a box of the Brown family literature. Original documents, original photographs, Lots of newspaper clippings and stuff from the 1910, 1920s, 1930s. Actual programs from the 1935 dedication of the park out in Kansas with the dedication of the statue. There can't be more than 2 or 3 of those pieces of paper left in the world. Most people probably used them for toilet tissue, maybe? I don't know. But at any rate, I got all those things, and I'm still sorting through it. It's really a massive archive. And eventually, I'm no spring chicken, I realize that too. I'm 76, so eventually they will have to, all these archives will have to go to some repository, and we'll find out eventually where that's going to be.
Jonesboro Library.
That is a possibility. That could well be. I've heard a couple other suggestions about Kansas and stuff like that, and even the Virginia archives or West Virginia archives, but time will tell. All right, so this is what we're going to be talking about. Who was actually John Brown? And I must admit he was a complex man. A man of many talents and a man of some failures. So we'll kind of address all those. All right, let me figure out which is the arrow here. All right, as I mentioned, John Brown was born in Torrington, Connecticut. His father's name was Owen Brown, and his mother's name was Ruth. And they had a bunch of kids, not as many as one would think. And I was talking earlier to some of the folks about how large families were in the 18th and 19th centuries. And the reason was because a lot of children never made it out of infancy. A lot of children died at childbirth. A lot of them fell ill to massive, infections and epidemics, diphtheria and stuff. So, and then of course they had no immunity. So even the common things like pneumonia and stuff that we would recover from nowadays, or maybe even COVID, who knows, they fell victims to and died. So Brown actually has a number of siblings. He has 3 brothers, all younger than him, plus a stepbrother as well, an adopted brother. And he has one older sister, Anna. So he's the second oldest of the family. And he's born on May 9th of the year 1800. And it's kind of easy to track Brown's career because he is born in 1800. So it's easy to figure out how old he is as we progress step by step through all of this. All right. His father, Owen Brown, had been brought up as a Calvinist or a Puritan, very religious, very methodical, very fundamental. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depends upon your perspective, that is the philosophy that he imparts on all his children. And Brown himself, John Brown, is very impressionable, and he studies the Bible religiously, he follows the 10 Commandments, and he feels that he has some sort of calling, some sort of God's will vision for him. In 1805, when Brown is, how old? 5. I knew you didn't pick that up in a hurry. Owen Brown takes his whole family and they move to Hudson, Ohio. And I must admit, I mentioned this earlier to a couple of folks, that it's intriguing to me as we follow Brown's life, how many miles he puts on. He travels everywhere. Particularly when travel in the mid and early 19th century was very, very difficult. Just dirt, muddy roads. Occasionally you might come across a wooden plank road or a log corduroy road. But you will find out as we go through here that Brown, born in Connecticut, he goes back to Connecticut a number of times. He goes to Massachusetts, he's back and forth to Kansas. He's in Ohio, he's in Iowa, he goes up to Canada, then he's back in Massachusetts, he goes to New York. I mean, he travels and travels and travels. Oftentimes, unfortunately, at the expense of being away from his family and also away from his businesses. And we'll talk about that as well. Okay, Owen Brown, the father, was a tanner by trade. And he was a very successful tanner, owned a very, very productive tannery, and he becomes very wealthy and very influential, very civic-minded, In fact, he ends up being on the board of trustees of Oberlin College. And by the way, my wife's mother attended and graduated from Oberlin College as a concert pianist. So at any rate, Brown stays there for a short time. In fact, Brown learns the tanning trade from his father, and he picks it up rather quickly. And while he's doing that, he also learns how to herd sheep, typical farm type stuff, rural family. Herd sheep, train horses, herd cattle. In fact, during the War of 1812, when American General William Hull is out there in the Midwest, John Brown ends up herding cattle to feed the army. I mean, that's something most people have never even thought about. Anyway, as we see here, one of the employees that Owen Brown has for a short time is Jesse Grant. Jesse Grant actually lives with the Browns for a short period of time. And for most Civil War historians like me, everyone knows that Jesse Brown is the father of Hiram Ulysses Grant, better known as Ulysses Simpson Grant. Most people don't know Hiram was his real first name. And of course, later on in the Civil War, everyone talks about U.S. Grant, Ulysses Simpson Grant. Simpson was Grant's mother's maiden name. But when Grant goes to West Point, he decides to drop the Hiram Ulysses Grant, because those initials spell out hug. Not very militaristic. So, at any rate, so kind of a neat little tidbit there. Now, unfortunately, John Brown does not have much of a formal education, but he wants to become a minister. Again, his father has been preaching ministry to him for years and years and years. So, in fact, to get a little bit prepared for a career as a minister, and again, John Brown could read Scripture, could quote Scripture, and so that was his calling. And again, Calvinistic, puritanical. At any rate, so Brown decides he needs to have a better education. His father sends him up to Springfield, Massachusetts to go to prep school. And after that, he's sent over to Litchfield, Connecticut to attend the academy. Unfortunately, Brown suffers from poor health. Most historians say that he had problems with his eyesight. And we'll see a picture of Brown, and you look at those eyes, they're downright scary. But most people think that he had health issues related to his vision. And of course, then eventually money runs out, and lo and behold, John Brown has to go back to Ohio. Now, it's interesting thinking about Ohio. Ohio at this time, of course, was still a territory, and had just recently been opened up for settling. And of course, again, if you were an 18th century historian, you would realize that the Battle of Falling Timbers in Ohio in the 1790s against the Indians, and that was led by Mad Anthony Wayne. And of course, most of us from Virginia know that Waynesboro in the valley is named for Mad Anthony Wayne. But at any rate, so when General Wayne defeats the Indians, that opens up all of this Ohio territory for new settling. And that area becomes termed as the Western Reserve. And so it's reserved for settlers. And it becomes a real geographic hotbed for anti-slave theory, abolitionist theory. Okay. At any rate, even though he had little formal education, as you can see, he realized that he had this calling, this religious calling, and he's quoted as, "I am an abolitionist." And that's going to kind of guide his fate the rest of his life. As I mentioned, served with General Hull's army, herding cattle. And by the way, it does say here that even as a teenager, his father promotes him to be a foreman of the tannery. So he's got a lot of older employees working at his father's tannery. You can see some of the hides and stuff stretched out for drying there. But here you got a rather young kid who apparently knows a lot about tanning hides. Of course, he'd been a shepherd and herded cattle and stuff, so he's been around cattle all his life, so I guess skinning a cow is pretty much the same. And well, I mentioned that he was up in Litchfield, Connecticut, attending the academy, and there's the church that he attended up there in Litchfield. And again, he had to return back to Ohio because of finances and health. At the age of 20, which means it happened in 1820, because he was born in 1800. I told you this is simple math. Brown actually marries Diane Lusk, and she was a local Hudson, Ohio girl. And as you can see, she bears him 7 kids. I mentioned big families, but alas, many of them die all too soon. She passes away in 1832 after 12 years of marriage. And shortly thereafter, Brown marries a second time. And his new wife going to bear him 13 children. 20 kids. If they'd all lived, that'd been a lot of mouths to feed. So what does Brown do to help pay for their food? Well, he's in the tanning business. He opens up his own tannery. And some of those turn out to be relatively successful tanneries. He learned well from his father. And as he, unfortunately, his first wife passed away, but his second wife is going to live on and on and on and survive his demise. Okay, so here is his second wife, Mary. And it's interesting that some historians say that her last name was Day, Mary Day. And yet there's other documentation that says her last name was Troy. So, kind of perplexing. But you can, like I say, 90% of the historians say her maiden name was Day, and there's a 10% that say, I don't think so. I think her last name was actually Troy. So only after a year of his first wife's passing, he remarries, and like I say, ends up with 13 more children. Unfortunately, some of those die early too. And by the way, 3 of those children that she bears will be with him at Harpers Ferry at the end of the story. All right, so Brown, as a semi-successful tanner, he opens and closes a number of tanneries, sells some of them, and he starts getting involved in land speculation. Real estate is a dangerous business for him. And timing in real estate, I guess, is everything. We have any realtors out there, by the way? No one that would admit it. I get it. Unfortunately, the land that he buys, theoretically, on the riverbank and stuff, should be prime real estate. And unfortunately, no one's interested in buying it. So it lays dormant, and finally he unloads it at a loss. And lo and behold, later on, that becomes prime real estate. The city's built on it. If he'd only held on longer, I know. Real estate. Unfortunately, many of Brown's enterprises do not do well. And he starts facing some serious financial difficulties. And he gets angry at the system for that. Why am I not being successful? It's the system's fault. Meanwhile, he continues to espouse abolitionism. He still finds faith in God. He's still a servant of God. He has this vision down the road. One of the things that really aggravates him, I said sometimes he gets very angry, is this incident here. Reverend Lovejoy was a Presbyterian minister, and he was an abolitionist. And in this particular incident, Lovejoy gets shot and killed while trying to suppress some rabble-rousers, some pro-slavery types. that wanted to destroy a printing press that was printing abolitionist papers. So these pro-slavers, end up attacking the building. Lovejoy gets shot. And Brown sees that as some sort of a sign from God, that this is edging us towards conclusion of the slavery issue. And he sees a lot of symbolism, a lot of iconography in events. And I guess looking back now, 170 so years later, I could probably understand that myself. And we'll talk about some of those other events, legislative events that lead to the American Civil War and to Brown's actions. The final quote there about Brown: "Here before God in the presence of these witnesses, from this time I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery." Rather blatant and open. As I mentioned, Brown had raised sheep and cattle and stuff as a child, so now he becomes really involved in the sheep herding business. So he raises sheep, and the next step from raising sheep is cutting the fleece and processing the wool. And he thinks that, I'm not doing very well in some of my other land businesses and stuff. Maybe I should stick with sheep and wool and processing and weaving that into fibers and all that stuff, following the whole through the system. So he actually goes to all the way to Springfield, Massachusetts, to find a partner. And while he's in Springfield, Massachusetts, he becomes involved with a number of African American issues. And he actually attends some black churches. And he meets with his partner up there that we'll see in just a minute here. And you'll see that one of the influential people he bumps into is Frederick Douglass. And we'll see more about Frederick Douglass as we pursue the story. Now, Brown was part of the Underground Railroad. And in fact, he actually becomes a conductor on the Underground Railroad. They use one of his homes, and he moves around back and forth from Ohio to Pennsylvania, and back up to New England, and back to Ohio again, and goes back and forth. Well-traveled, as I mentioned earlier. This is the earliest picture of him, and it's actually called a daguerreotype. It's actually done on a copper sheet, copper plate. And look at that face. It's very stern, rather deep-set, piercing eyes, kind of a frightening-looking fellow. And you see that odd pennant that he's carrying? That's actually the flag of his Underground Railroad program, this subterranean pass-through, as it's termed. Now, one of the folks that he's impressed with is Gerrit Smith, who lives in the Adirondacks up in New York State. And Gerrit Smith was quite a character. He was very wealthy. He was a philanthropist who donated lots of money. And in fact, one of his pet projects was granting free land to free blacks. I mean, what's wrong with free? Sounds good to me. And I have to chuckle. Smith ran for president, I don't know, 3 times, 4 times. Never successful, obviously. It kind of reminded me most of us were around in the mid-20th century, me incled. Most of us remember Adlai Stevenson. How many times did he run for president? Well, that's kind of the Gerrit Smith story, the same thing, 3 or 4 times for Adlai. All right, so this is Gerrit Smith's actual office on his estate, this little brick building. And that's where he would sign off on those land grants to free blacks. Yeah, poor old Brown and his finances. It just gets worse and worse and worse for him. He spends more time traveling. He starts to get more and more into speech giving and fundraising. to support his abolitionist views. And of course, all this traveling, of course, costs money. Someone has to, foot the bill. And in fact, we're going to see some of his fundraisers and some of his backers here very shortly. And this Self-Protection League for Free Blacks and Fugitive Slaves, that's rather interesting because Brown has kind of a militant streak in him because he's angry at the system. He's angry at slavery. He's angry at Congress for what we're going to see happen as far as congressional legislation. Now, while he's up there in New York, he determines that, there must be a way to liberate large numbers of slaves. And that's where he comes up with this subterranean passway, this through pass. Basically, it's a type of underground railroad, but it's a little more militant than just helping people out. He suggests that maybe for self-defense, we should issue them weapons, these runaway slaves, the fugitive slaves. We should give them weapons in case they need them on the way. So it's a little more edgy than what we would think. He referred to them as the abolitionist warriors. And of course, the final destination, as it says, is supposedly Canada. And that's going to be the final destination for most of the time until the end. Now here we see Willis Hodges, who's the publisher of one of the anti-slavery newspapers. And this one's called The Ram's Horn. I did bring in one of the anti-slavery newspapers over there, one of the originals from the 1850s, to just look at. I would ask you not to touch that. It's cold and brittle, sort of like me. So again, he meets Frederick Douglass, and Brown kind of hit it off again, and Brown starts writing these articles. And some of the articles are, very abolitionist, very radical, and some of them are very soft and gentle. Some of them are aimed at the black population. Some of them are suggesting that these are the way that you can better be received, better personal conduct, better way to be assimilated, if you want. And then he talks again about social justice, trying to eliminate some of those black stereotypes. He talked about the Sambo mistakes. One of Brown's sons, by the way, ends up in, John Jr., ends up in New York City. And he's a phrenologist. How many of y'all know what a phrenologist is? Yeah, head reader. You massage the scalp and read the scalp, read your future. Instead of looking at your palm, I can tell that you're going to marry a blonde by feeling the top of your head. Okay. But that kind of stuff was, I guess, in vogue in the 19th century. And actually up until the 1920s, phrenology was considered a science. While he's visiting his son in New York, he sees overt racism every single day in the streets of New York City. And these are free blacks being treated this way. So you can imagine how he feels slaves in the South must be treated. Legislation. Something else to make John Brown really, really angry. One of the first pieces, and actually there's one even before this, but I'll talk about the Fugitive Slave Act first. Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 says it's every citizen's responsibility to help capture fugitive slaves. If you don't help capture them, then you're an accessory to the fact. And there's severe penalties for that. So even if you're a white person, you're helping out as a conductor or run a station stop on the Underground Railroad, on the pass-through, subterranean pass-through, you get caught, you're going to pay a price. And yet again, Brown sees this as maybe a message from God. This is edging us closer to some sort of final decision on the slavery issue. Now, Brown in 1855 actually moves his family all the way to Elba, New York. And they're going to stay there the rest of his lifetime and past that. And that's not far from Lake Placid. Now, some of us might remember the Olympics from 19-something, that were the Winter Olympics in Lake Placid. And surprisingly, one of my final choices or one of my final assignments in the military was as the Provost Marshal, the Chief of Police at Fort Drum, New York, 10th Mountain Division, Watertown, right on the Canadian border, northern tier, not all that far from Lake Placid. Again, I don't believe in coincidences, but sometimes things happen for whatever reason. At this time, Brown creates this organization, the United States League of Gileadites. And of course, Gileadites, if you read through the thing there, it was a small group of armed Israelis or Israelites who defended their property and their families from invaders. A biblical analogy, very typical of John Brown. He was a biblical scholar. And as you can see, look at that Bowie knife. Of course, Bowie knives have been around for decades by this time. You know, Jim Bowie, who supposedly developed that with the clip point and all that. Of course, it died at the Alamo in March of 1836, 20 years earlier. So supposedly, some historians say that Brown actually issued out these Bowie knives to African-American congregants at that Zion African-American church. Oh, the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This was supposed to be the cure-all to make sure that slave states and free states would be balanced forever and ever. All right? And they actually come out with supposedly a scientific way. I say they, Congress, comes up with a scientific solution that at the latitude of 36 degrees and 30 minutes, all the area of the United States south of that could be considered slave areas. Everything north of that would be considered free areas. But as we're going to find out, that's not necessarily true. So what happens here to resolve the issue in 1820 was that the area called Maine, which up until this time, by the way, had been part of Massachusetts. Maine wants to create their own state. Well, if we allow Maine, which is north of that latitude, okay, to become a free state, well, to maintain the balance, we have to have at least one state to go slavery. Well, what state is that going to be? It's going to be Missouri. So that maintains that balance, at least temporarily. 4 years after that, or 34 years after that, is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And I mentioned this a little earlier to one or two of the folks here. And theoretically, this too was going to be some sort of a balancing compromise act where Kansas and Nebraska, by the way, were still territories. They were not states yet. So the idea was, well, we'll let these territories determine their own destiny. We will let the settlers of those two territories vote on the issue, whether or not they want to enter the United States as a free or as a slave-holding state. Once statehood is actually offered. It's not going to be offered to them for a few more years. But this starts that ball rolling. And what's going to happen is a lot of the pro-slavers from Missouri, and by the way, Kansas and Nebraska are the adjacent territories to Missouri, if you kind of look at that map. But what's going to happen is there's going to be a lot of action to try to convince those two territories to vote pro-slavery. And where is this action coming from? People from Missouri, the slave-holding state of Missouri. And these people have become known, I don't want to use the term terrorists, but maybe that's what they were. These border ruffians is the term that gets slammed around. These border ruffians, and sometimes numbering of 300 or 400 at a time, and sometimes much smaller groups, they would invade into Kansas and try to convince the settlers who are, free staters, that that's the wrong way to go. You need to be a pro-slaver, and if not, we're going to attack you. We're going to burn your house. We're going to chase you out of here, and then we're going to put some of our people in here and occupy your territory, and then they can vote for slavery. So this Missouri Compromise of 1820 and now this Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, neither one of those things are going to be very helpful in resolving the issue. The Dred Scott versus Sanford case in 1857. The Supreme Court of the United States, I think I got another slide showing here. Here kind of this Kansas-Nebraska Act that we were talking about, voting on whether or not to allow slavery or not. Congress hoped that that was going to solve the issue, but again, it's not. Instead, what we're going to have is what becomes known as bleeding Kansas. The blood being shed to convince the Kansas settlers to vote for pro-slavery. Now, in this 1850s time frame, there's a new political party rising, the Republican Party. And of course, as we all know, the first Republican Party president was Abraham Lincoln. And most of us know that the Republican Party was pro-freedom. And in fact, they actually opposed this Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. They wanted to abolish slavery entirely. It was an abomination to God. In fact, later on, Lincoln himself says that famous quotation about a house divided against itself cannot long stand. So even Lincoln understands that eventually this issue of slavery versus free states is going to have to be resolved one way or the other. Now here's a group photo of John Brown's sons. And like I say, three of his sons actually go with him to Harpers Ferry. And we'll talk about the two that actually get killed there. The border ruffians. All right. Brown has been in New Elbow, New York with his family, and he receives a letter from his kids out in Kansas. And his children are saying, hey, these border ruffians are coming over here and they're assaulting us free staters, us pro-abolitionists, and we need some help. We need some weapons. We need some money for defense. Dad, what can you do to help us out? So Dad decides, well, I will raise some more money, I'll make more speeches, I'll get some weapons if I can, and we'll head on out west. I'm not going to talk about the pike at this particular point. I'm going to save that because you have one over here. So that's kind of a big clincher. I love Civil War weaponry and stuff, 19th century weaponry. Henry Ward Beecher, one of his financial supporters in the East, offers to buy these Sharps carbines. And this is the model 1853 Sharps carbine. It's very distinctive because it has this brass patch box on the end of the butt there. It has a brass barrel band, very attractive looking weapon. It fires a 52 caliber lead bullet, conical bullet. Very compact, easy to hide, rather than a longer musket or a longer rifle. And Beecher ships those out there to Iowa, I think it is originally. And he ships them out there in crates marked Bibles. And henceforth it becomes known as Beecher's Bibles. Sharps carbines, model 1853, Beecher's Bibles. And by the way, if you ever come across one of these and the serial number of Beecher's Bibles, they're worth a lot of money, like $50,000. And so very, very unusual. And as you can see, Brown continues to head westward, and he stops in a number of places: Akron, Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio. He stops in Iowa, making speeches, trying to raise money for the defense in Kansas. So I mentioned Bleeding, Kansas. Yeah, would Kansas enter the Union as a slave state or free? And of course, even though the election happens later in 1850s, Kansas does not become a state until, anybody know? 1861, that's right. And so it becomes the 34th state. Anyone know what the 35th state is? West Virginia, June 20th, 1863. Ah, that was a quiz and you all failed. The border ruffians again, violating the rule of law. And it's interesting because Brown has been inching further and further and further towards this militant mentality, buying weapons with the money that he's raised. And now when the border ruffians start raiding and killing in Kansas, he determines that, again, that's a sign from God, that if violence will beget violence, so therefore it's okay to kill the border ruffians because they're killing us or killing the Free Staters. Emotional darkness. Now, some of the other issues that happen that inch us closer to some sort of climax between free state versus slave state decision-making is this one. Now, Brooks is a U.S. representative from South Carolina. Senator Sumner is a senator from Massachusetts. Obviously, one is a free stater, one is a slave stater. And Brooks, being from South Carolina, loses his temper over the issue of slavery being discussed again and again and again and again in Congress. So he goes from the House over to the Senate and just beats the daylights out of Senator Sumner. Actually almost kills the senator with a cane, beating him over the head again and again. Now we see that as Brown makes his way back to Kansas, the infamous Potawatomi. And Brown's family is living there at the time, and lo and behold, there's an attack by the border ruffians. And in retaliation, Brown goes to Potawatomi, and he finds 5 slave-holding owners in cabins, and he and his force drag them out, and rather than shooting them, which would have been, I guess, the humane way of doing away with your opponent, they're hacked to death with machetes and swords. Sounds pretty gruesome and terrible. But it sets a message that this is what we're going to do with pro-slavers. If you're killing us, we're going to kill you, and even more brutally. We're sending you a big-time message. Now, Brown himself says, well, I didn't kill anybody, but I tacitly approved it. You know, does that make me guilty? Well, in the eyes of the law, it will. Now, most people refer to the Battle of Osawatomie as being famous for Brown. And in fact, after the Battle of Osawatomie, and by the way, in Kansas, that was all Native American indigenous population, you know, at one time, just like Ohio was as we pushed the Native Americans further and further west. So if you go into Kansas, Indian names are everywhere, towns, cities. And of course, even here in the East Coast, it's that way. I know this is not a Native American history class, but I can tell you that, here in Virginia and on the East Coast, there are so many Native American Indian names and terms, we don't even think about them. Yeah, for example, Potomac. Anyone know what Potomac River means? Potomac? It means among the walnuts. So apparently there must have been lots of walnut trees along the Potomac River at one time. I was raised in the Shenandoah Valley. Anyone know what Shenandoah means? Oh, come on. Someone's got to know. Well, it means daughter of the stars. Isn't that lovely? Yeah. So when you travel in the Shenandoah Valley, you can look up at the stars and think that you're a daughter of the stars or something. But there's a lot of, like the Algonquin Indian name, the opossum. Everyone knows what possums are, but that actually comes from the Algonquin Indian. All right. Well, at Osawatomie, it's a little different. As you can see, there's some 300 of these border ruffians coming over from Missouri, and they're going to attack Brown's little group of about 40 people. Yeah. So Brown is really outnumbered. They put up a pretty stiff defense, and they actually kill quite a few of these border ruffians. But unfortunately, one of his sons, one of John Brown's sons, gets killed in the operation here. I never understood this last sentence in here about, henceforth he gets known as Osawatomie Brown. I spent a lot of time in the military, and I never knew of any general, any commander who gets a moniker for a loss. I mean, usually you get a name for being a winner, the victory of the battle or something, but Osawatomie Brown sticks with him for the rest of his life, and in fact it turns out to be a bitter defeat, and they have to evacuate and seek refuge on the banks of the Osage River. And again, Kansas is still a territory. John Geary is the territorial governor, and he is just fed up with all this border war, these raids, this bloodshed. So he calls an immediate ceasefire. And he asks both sides to cease and desist, and he takes it one step further. He grants clemency to both sides for all the crimes and the murders that they've committed. In fact, two of John Brown's sons had been captured, and because of the clemency, his two sons are released back to freedom. Well, Brown thinks that, okay, the issue out here in Kansas is kind of settled down now. We got this ceasefire, it's time for me to go traveling again. So, lo and behold, off he goes back to the east. Doing public speaking all the way, trying to raise money. And here we see 5 members of what becomes known as his Secret Six, or the Committee of Six. It's called both. And these are big-time financial gurus, have lots of money, and they are going to fund rather heavily into John Brown's ventures. And in fact, the money that they're going to donate is basically going to fund his Harpers Ferry operation. We mentioned that Dred Scott case. And there's the Supreme Court Justice. And again, the more John Brown thinks about this issue, the angrier he gets. And in all his writings, and many of his speeches, he comes back to this issue of the Dred Scott case, of black runaway slaves being considered nothing more than chattel. They're nothing more than owned property. And if they run away, again, under that Fugitive Slave Act, you, as an American citizen in the North, are obligated to return him back to his master, back to his owner. And again, that's an abomination to God in John Brown's eyes. Now here we see a cavalryman with one of those Sharp's carbines. And I'm going to talk about the pikes later again. but I just wanted to let you see there's a park ranger up there at Harpers Ferry with one of the pikes. This is Massachusetts State Kansas Committee. That's another one of those big financial backers. And they promised 200 of those Sharps carbines that the soldier is carrying. And while Brown is out in the East, he talks to this Charles Collins. And it's mentioned in the little narrative text over there by your pike. And Charles Collins is actually the foreman at the Collins Cutlery Company in Collinsville, Collinsville, Connecticut. So anyway, this Charles Blair is the foreman there. At any rate, Brown is thinking about what would be a good weapon to arm runaway freed slaves with, something that's not too complicated. We don't have a whole lot of time for training of using a Sharps carbine or a revolver and how they get loaded and all that stuff. We want something very simple, something very rudimentary, and something quite frightening. And what's more frightening than a spear? A medieval or ancient times, Roman times, Greek times spear. Now, during the Battle of Blackjack, Kansas, which, by the way, turns out to be one of Brown's significant victories during the Bleeding Kansas. Oh, I see him giving me a pump up there. I appreciate that. At the Battle of Blackjack, Kansas, Brown is a victor, and he captures a whole lot of weapons and stuff there. And one of the weapons that really impresses him is this rather long knife. It's a double-edged dagger called a dirk. The blade is 8 or 9 inches long. So it's like a side knife, like an Arkansas toothpick, as we would say. And so Brown was impressed with that. So when he talks to Blair in Connecticut, he said, you know, that spear would probably be a pretty good weapon to use. You run a cutlery company, you could probably punch out a whole bunch of these spears for me. Except I'd like to have the spear point a little bit longer and a little bit wider, and I'd like them mounted on a 6-foot shaft. Now, the wood used for these shafts were supposed to be ash. Ash is the relatively hard wood, and it was basically the wood used on every single farm implement, shovels and hay railers and all that stuff during the 19th century. So ash was readily available, it was made in all sorts of handles and shafts and stuff, so getting those for pikes, for a spear, should be a piece of cake. Well, Blair says, yeah, I can make you 500 of those at $1.25 a piece. Or, being a sharp businessman, I can make you 1,000 of them for $1 a piece. So Brown says, well, that sounds more logical. He says, I think I'll order 1,000, but before I order 1,000, could you make me just a dozen as a sample so I can actually examine them, go out there and beat them against a tree or stick them into a log or something to see how they function. So Blair says, okay, I can do that. So he makes 12 of them and takes them up to Springfield, Massachusetts, shows them to Brown, and Brown goes out there and works on them, tests them, and he says, these just aren't right. He said, well, you know, we need to have a longer shaft on the thing. 6 feet is just too short. And besides, I'm not quite satisfied with those little conical collars, and you can see the ferrule is what it's called. This 3 or 4 inch collar. He says, I'm not quite satisfied with that. You know, you made them out of thin sheet metal. I'd rather have them stronger. I'd rather have them out of cast iron. So they wouldn't snap off, they wouldn't bend and stuff. And besides, instead of putting a simple rivet through there, you know, I think it'd be easier or smarter to put just a screw. That way I could, if necessary, I could disassemble them, or I could get all the parts and assemble them, have my followers assemble them themselves for ease of shipping. So Blair says, okay, I can do that. He says, so don't forget, I need some money. And you want these when? In 90 days? Well, I'll do my best. Well, so Blair goes ahead and casts the blades, rough casts the blades. But 90 days comes and goes. Where's John Brown with the money? And doesn't show up. Couldn't raise the funds. So Blair says, well, rather than remelting these, I'll just save these and maybe we can use them for something else later on. So he sets them aside, voids out the contract. As we're going to see years later, Brown's going to come back for those. All right. In 1858, while he's trying to raise funds and all that stuff up in Worcester, Massachusetts, Springfield, Massachusetts, New Haven, Connecticut, Syracuse, New York, Boston, Massachusetts, he travels all the time, giving these orations. And he does meet a lot of famous folks: Harriet Tubman, Ralph Waldo Emerson, David Thoreau, and we'll see some pictures of them. One of the interesting people he does meet and actually hires is this guy by the name of Hugh Forbes. Forbes is a mercenary. He's a soldier of fortune. He had fought with Garibaldi, and by the way, this is the same Garibaldi that later on in the Civil War will command the Louisiana Tigers at the Battle of First Manassas, or Bull Run, in summer of 1861. So anyway, Forbes is a military tactician. He learned his military skill from Garibaldi in overseas wars. And here's some of his other influential celebrity benefactors. We mentioned both of those. Well, Forbes and many of Brown's followers and Brown himself end up going out to Springdale, Iowa. And this is the house that they use for their headquarters. So they're there to plan the future operations, whether they be invasion of Kansas, invasion of Virginia, whatever it's going to be. They're going to discuss these plans. The subterranean pass-through is part of the plans, still going up to Canada. So what happens is Forbes gets mad. He says, well, you promised to pay me for my services. I don't see any money, and I'm your military tactician, and I tell you what you should do and how you should organize it, where you should stage your weapons along the route and stuff. But if you're not going to pay me, I'm out of here. So he turns around and walks away. So that's one follower that walks away from John Brown. Here we see Frederick Douglass again, and Douglass and Brown start again publishing articles in magazines, newspapers, all on the abolitionist venture. Now, what happens is those members of that Secret Six, or that Committee of Six, the more militant Brown becomes, they get a little antsy about having their names exposed if in fact something goes wrong. So they kind of back off. They still have already donated lots of money, but they're starting to back off a little bit from Brown's militancy. So what does Brown do? He says, well, okay, I'll quietly leave the scene, and he goes back to Kansas again. More miles on his feet. Some of the other people he meets, Osborne Anderson. Yeah, up in Canada. He's a newsman up there in Ontario. And Harriet Tubman. I mean, he's moving in tall circles here. So he goes all the way up to Canada, up to Chatham, Ontario. And his intention at this point is to somehow create an independent state, an independent republic. At one point, he's actually thought about creating these, I hate to use that term, sanctuary cities, but he thinks about creating these safe havens, these sanctuary cities, or he uses the term forts. Again, a military term. Somewhere in the mountains of western Virginia, up and down the Blue Ridge, the Alleghenies, the Appalachians, all the way up to Canada. So instead of being an underground railroad, hiding people. They can go there. Runaway slaves can seek refuge there. They can get weapons there. They can eat and fatten up for the next log up to the next fort, all the way up to Canada. And again, this kind of really scares that Secret Six. And it's interesting that about 2,000 of the residents of Chatham, Ontario, are actually runaway slaves from the south of the United States. 2,000 runaway slaves. And Brown thinks, I can recruit every single one of those for my army. Whether I go, wherever I go, they will follow me willingly. Unfortunately, that's not going to be the case. He's going to be sorely disappointed. So Brown and his followers, while they're up there in Canada, they decide to, and by the way, this guy here on the left, this Major Martin Delaney, he's actually a physician. He's actually a doctor. And you can read down a lot of them there. He actually ends up in the Civil War as a physician, as a surgeon in the U.S. colored troops. But he's up there in Chatham, and he's one of the folks that helped develop this new Constitution. So this idea is to help the free black Dr. Delaney, serving blah, blah, blah. Okay? And this Constitution is going to have Brown as the head of the government of this new independent free state. Of course, he's going to have some cabinet members or assistants and advisors and stuff. But Brown is not a very good businessman. He's not a very good organizer. How would he be a head of any organization like this? And this is the building that they used as their headquarters for the convention. Yeah, check the back. I think there's an image of that, a copy of that same image here in your wall. The key word here is in that constitutional convention that they write is recognizing slavery as unjustifiable of one portion of the citizens upon another. So he firmly establishes that as one of the tenets, just like a Bill of Rights. Well, with kind of recognizing the Secret Six or a little bit backing away from all of this, Brown decides to sheepishly go back to Kansas. Oh, man. And here he meets up with another abolitionist, James Montgomery. And Brown actually leads a raid into Missouri. I mean, we've been talking about the border ruffians coming to Kansas all the time, but this is going back and forth on both sides. So now we got Brown moving from Kansas into Missouri. He liberates or frees or steals, however way you want to define it, about a dozen slaves and physically conducts them as an Underground Railroad conductor, escorts them all the way up to Detroit, puts them on a ferry, and goes across over to Windsor, Canada for freedom. Yeah, here we go. Talks about that very issue. So what happens is Brown goes back to see his family in New Alba, New York, one last time in the summer of 1859. It's the last time he's going to see his wife. From there, he goes back to Connecticut, talks to Blair one more time about, where are my pikes? Well, that was a couple of years ago. You know, I still got the heads over there, the pike blades and stuff. I haven't done anything since. So, well, you need to finish those in a hurry. I got some money now. So what does Blair do? He says, well, I'm really overwhelmed here at the cutlery company. The best I can do is have them parted out to somebody else. A guy named Charles Hart over in Unionville, Connecticut. So Blair arranges for those cast ferrules, those collars, and the screws, and the raw cast blades, and the guards, and the shafts, sends them over there to Charles Hart. Hart puts them all together. Remember, there was supposed to have been a contract for 1,000. But for some reason or other, there's only 954 at the end of the day. So 46 of them were either rejected, broken, whatever, none finished. So So Brown takes these 954 pikes and transports them through Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, down to Maryland, a place called the Kennedy Farm, about 4 miles on the Maryland side of the Potomac River from Harpers Ferry. So he stockpiled weapons there, those Sharps carbines, some revolvers, and these 954 pikes. So on that rainy Sunday night, I think it was the 16th of October of 1859, he loads up a wagon, puts about 50 of these pikes in there because he knows some of the slaves in Harpers Ferry are just going to be chomping at the bit to be declared free, and he's going to hand each one of them a pike. And so they captured the night watchman there at the bridge, at the Potomac River Bridge. They captured the night watchman at the Harpers Ferry Arsenal. And of course, that was the whole point, was to capture all the weapons and the ammunition at the arsenal, so he could use those to arm his followers. Well, so yeah, he captures the arsenal, and all of a sudden the local citizenry starts coming up with their own weapons. And Brown already has a couple civilian hostages, those 2 night watchmen and stuff. And all of a sudden, they're under attack by the local citizens. So what does Brown do? He seeks for some sort of defensive position. And the defensive position he finds is the engine house, the firehouse. And that becomes known as John Brown's Fort. And you'll see a picture of that over here. Well, the local citizenry encircle the engine house where Brown and his followers, there's only 21 of them at this point. He left 3 of them back there at the farm to guard the other supplies and stuff. So what happens is the citizens hold siege, and by the next morning, the Virginia militia has arrived. The word has gotten out. A railroad engineer had seen all this commotion, takes the train to D.C., tells the government up there, and the very next evening, lo and behold, 90 U.S. Marines, 1 Army lieutenant, J.E.B. Stuart, Jeb Stuart, most Civil War historians know him, the famous cavalryman, and they're led or commanded by an Army colonel, Robert E. Lee. Now, people often think, well, why would an Army guy be in charge of Marines? Well, that actually is not all that uncommon. In fact, in World War II, the 2nd Infantry Division in Europe, or in World War I, was commanded by a Marine general. Strange, but true. So now, all of a sudden, we got the Virginia militia, we got 90 active duty soldiers and Marines, and the local citizenry, and lo and behold, next morning, the Marines attack. 1 Marine is killed. About 10 of Brown's followers inside this little building die, to include 2 of Brown's sons. Brown is injured himself. They end up getting captured. And by the way, there are 4 local citizens, white citizens, that are killed. And unfortunately, one of the very first civilian Harpers Ferry casualties is a free black man, which is just the antithesis of what John Brown was supposed to stand for. Strange. So Brown is captured. He's taken to Charlestown, Virginia, the county seat of Jefferson County, although about 10 miles away. Incarcerated, he stands trial for murder, treason to Virginia, and then inciting to riot. Inciting to have a slave riot, Virginia and the Commonwealth, is serious, serious business going back to the Nat Turner days of August of 1831, when 55 or 60 whites were slain in the slave revolution or slave revolt. And of course, unfortunately, in retaliation, about 120 blacks are killed. And of course, Nat Turner and his followers basically get executed as well at the end. So inciting a slave riot is serious, serious business. He's found guilty. By the way, the court actually offers him an insanity plea. You can plead innocent due to insanity and be incarcerated. Brown turns that down because he has a point to make. And so he's found guilty on all those charges, and he spends another month in jail. Meanwhile, his brother Frederick, which was one of my wife's ancestors, came to visit him. He gets hanged about 11 o'clock in the morning on December 2nd of 1859. You'll see over here some of the photographs I took at the Jefferson County Museum and the courthouse. You'll see the actual courtroom where he faced trial. In fact, he was so ill, it's because of his injuries, they had to bring him to trial on a cot. But so at any rate, you'll see not only the courthouse, the courtroom, you'll also see one of the John Brown pikes that they have in their collection, and you'll also see the furniture freight wagon over there that they made him sit on top of his coffin and ride to the gallows, which are several blocks away. Now that sounds pretty gruesome, but that was very common practice in the 19th century, so it was not unusual. Now we often ask about, and by the way, it came through without incident. Harpers Ferry and both Charlestown were guarded heavily during that whole month awaiting execution, but there was no riot. Lots of media coverage and that kind of stuff, but no real riot. I must admit, you think about who was John Brown. That was the primary question, and I wish I had a quick, easy answer, but he was a complex man like most of us are. I mean, he was a son, he was a father, he was a brother, he was married twice, the father of 20 children, and he was a religious zealot, he was a biblical scholar. Whether or not he was a traitor or a hero, maybe history will tell. But complex man. All right, thank you, Deb.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to Dr. Schmit. And with that, we will conclude the evening. I would invite you to come back in November. I think it's November 12th. When we will have Chan Light speaking about the history of Lynchburg Friends, meaning Lynchburg Quakers. So I hope that you can come back then. And I hope that Steve will have a few minutes here. In case you have questions, please come on up and ask him individually. And also, you'll have an opportunity to see some of the things that he brought with him. Thank you.
A wooden plank or a wooden corduroy road with just logs side by side.
It is.
But he traveled back and forth between Ohio and the east, and I say east, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut. Then he'd be up in Canada, and then he'd be back out in Kansas again. Then he'd be in Iowa, and then back in, he just went everywhere. Like, how difficult, how long should it have taken? I mean, even now, if you drive from case in the 1850s, or the fugitive slave law.
Yeah, that's true.
All those things that happened in the 1850s that just make John Brown so fanatically angry that he would take it on his own volition to do God's work. That was his religious calling. So we'll talk more about that too.
He wasn't a Quaker.
No.
Okay. So I know that this guy, William Denny, that petitioned all these slaves now, to try to find more about him. But I couldn't find much, but when I did, I was looking for him in Augusta County. He popped up in Louisa County. And I could tell by the census that all his neighbors were black people, and he was a white guy. And he was the one that took him free all the killing. But I figured he might have been a Quaker. I ain't sure.